Hello and welcome. When somebody normally says Bristol VR, you tend to think of National Bus Company Poppy Red or National Bus Company Leaf Green. But as we've seen in a previous video about the West Midlands PTE Bristol VRs, we all know that's not necessarily true. But what if I was to tell you some of the most unusual and rarest VRs were actually owned by a PTE? Come with me on a return journey back to Liverpool in the 1970s as we look at the Merseyside PTE Bristol VRs. The majority of the passenger transport executives were set up by the Transport Act of 1968, and I have done a short video on this, and I'll try to remember to put a little link in because it's only 3 minutes long and it gives quite a handy explanation of what happened and how they were formed. This Transport Act would take effect from the 1st of December 1969, and on Merseyside it would see the three municipal companies of Birkenhead Corporation, Wallasey Corporation and Liverpool Corporation brought under common management. All three of these municipalities had been former tramway operators and were what you could call progressive bus operators. None of them were afraid to try new things, and this was highlighted by the fact that Wallasey had one of the first Leyland Atlanteans in operation. This of course being the very famous and very well known Wallasey No. 1 FHF 451, which would enter service in 1958. But both Birkenhead and Liverpool Corporation would also end up operating Leyland Atlanteans, as would the PTE that followed. And although Merseyside PTE was very well known for its fleet of Leyland Atlanteans, it did operate other types as well: Daimler Fleet Lines, Dennis Dominators, MCW Metro buses, MCW Metropolitans and Leyland Olympians, as well as a single-decker fleet comprising of things like Panthers, Bristol REs and Leyland Nationals, to name a few. But we've jumped a little bit ahead of ourselves. As would be the case with many of the PTEs on their formation, they would inherit a large amount of rear-loading front-engine double-decker buses though, despite all these newer buses that had already entered the fleets. And of course these half-cab rear-loading buses certainly weren't suitable for one-man operation, and one-man operated buses was the thing of the day. The early 1970s, the bus industry in general was going through a bit of a crisis. In fact, it had been going through a crisis since the mid-1960s. Operating costs were continuing to rise, whilst passenger numbers was continuing to drop. By having a bus operated by one person as opposed to two people would help save a huge amount of money. But it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to do the maths and see how much of this saving was offset by buying these new buses and also the increased maintenance cost on these new buses as well, because as we all know, the rear engine buses did take a little bit more looking after than the front engine buses. I wonder if it was more of a placebo effect where the bus companies thought they were saving money by having them one man operated, but they were actually spending the same, if not more money, on maintenance and also the upkeep of these buses. Now, I'm sure there's those of you watching this video who will probably have the answer to this question, or at least have theories on it, and I'd be very interested to hear those answers and read those theories in the comments down below. It was a very turbulent time for the bus industry. Initially on Merseyside there was very little change with the formation of the PTE. Birkenhead and Wallasey on the south side of the River Mersey came under Wirral division of the PTE. And here would be a new livery introduced, which was a bit of a blend of both Birkenhead and Wallasey, and the buses would be painted in Birkenhead blue with Wallasey cream, which was quite a nice touch to be fair, this being applied in the former Wallasey livery layout. In the city of Liverpool itself, the change of ownership was probably very less apparent. Buses were still painted in the identical green livery of Liverpool Corporation, but these had been fitted with the PTE insignia in place of the Liverpool coat of arms. Now, one thing about the PTEs, as we've seen in the video about the Selneck Bristol VRs, which I did a little while ago, and again I'm going to try and remember to put a little link up to that video in the top right hand corner, is that they took on the orders from their predecessors and in most cases honoured these orders and made the buses their own. Now when the PTEs were formed, they didn't have a standard type of vehicle. This was all to follow, this was all in the future. And they really had to make do with what the predecessors had been operating. Now there's probably at least one exception to this, and I'm thinking of Strathclyde PTE, which inherited a vast fleet of Glasgow Corporation Leyland Atlanteans and continued to build on it too. But the other PTEs that had been formed at the time, Merseyside, Selneck in Manchester, West Midlands and Tyneside over in the northeast, all had a mishmash of vehicle types that they were now operating. Now you may have thought I've missed out South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire PTEs, but these wouldn't come for another few years yet. And by that time the older, more established PTEs were settling down to ordering their standard type of vehicles. Now around the time that the PTEs were formed, Bristol had launched a new model. Now as I've said previously on the channel, at the time Bristol was having a little bit of a success story. The low decker had been a really cutting edge design, which really had only been spoilt by the fact that it could only be sold to the nationalised Tilling fleets and Scottish fleets. The pinnacle of the low decker design would be released, and it would be the FLF type, flat floor, long wheelbase, forward entrance. And you can't help but thinking, even if it had gone head to head with the Leyland Atlantean on the open market, it probably would have still done quite well. You see, in the old days, if you'd have wanted a low height bus, say one of about 13'6" for example, to get under low bridge obstructions, you'd have had to have had a low bridge design, and this would have meant an offside gangway with 4 abreast seating on the upper deck. Not very convenient, and a little claustrophobic to be fair. Back in October, and this is 2025 for those of you watching on catch up, Melissa and myself went for a ride on a K5G type low bridge bus at the Isle of Wight Bus Museum White Rider event, and it was fully loaded. And with that 4 abreast seating upstairs, it was rather claustrophobic. And I'm not sure whether it's the fact that people in the old days were a little bit smaller and more petite, but for the life of me, I couldn't get both bum cheeks on that seat upstairs. I was half in the gangway and half on the seat. And on a bus journey, you don't want to move up too close to the person next to you because, well, bus journeys aren't about that sort of intimacy, are they? But the Bristol low-decker did away with all that social awkwardness because it allowed a central gangway with the conventional 2+2 seating in a low-height build bus, all thanks to some clever design work and mechanical genius under the lower deck floor. The Bristol RE was another example of Bristol's genius at the time. This was a single-decker bus with a rear low-slung engine, and that engine could be either the busman's favourite Gardner or the busman's other favourite, the Leyland engine. But this low-slung engine would allow a boot to be fitted when the vehicle was in dual-purpose or coach mode. Admittedly not a very big boot, but it was still a boot. This bus arrived just at the right time when the legalisation of longer single-decker one-man operated buses was increased. And soon after this, Leyland would buy a 25% stake in Bristol Commercial Vehicles, which would mean that Bristol could now sell onto the open market. The Bristol RE was an instant success, and had it not been for the Leyland National, it probably would have been a resounding success all the way up to the very early 1980s. 1966 would see the legalisation of one-man operated double-decker buses, and for many operators who'd already bought fleets of Atlanteans and fleet lines, all they really had to do was convert these buses to one-man operation, and that was a relatively simple exercise. Normally it would involve fitting a ticket machine, obviously, and a periscope so the upper deck could be viewed from the cab. And some operators would specify that the destination blinds could only be changed from the cab. Or that should be, some unions would specify that the destination blinds could only be changed from the cab, as the unions still held quite a lot of power and sway at this time. But Bristol was caught napping because it didn't have a rear-engined front entrance bus that could suitably be used for one-man operation. And I have done a video on the Bristol VR, and it's one of my older videos, and it's not quite up to the production value as these current videos, so I will put a little link into that, but I do apologise that it's a little bit old, it's a little bit clunky. It's a little bit like comparing Betamax with VHS really, or maybe Betamax with Blu-ray, who knows. The VR was launched in 1966 and originally had an offset inline engine and was categorised as the Bristol VRL, this code pointing to the position of the engine, vertical rear longitudinal. In 1968, the government of the time announced a bus grant, and there would be money available for people who bought buses that would be suitable for one-man operation. But much to Bristol's dismay, this didn't allow buses with longitudinal engines to qualify for this grant. It only applied to vehicles with transverse engines, that is, engines that are fitted across the back of the chassis lengthways. And you can't really help but feel sorry for Bristol because they were stitched up by their paymasters, the government themselves. The government at that point still had a share in Bristol commercial vehicles, and for them to do that does seem a little bit strange, doesn't it? But then I suppose anybody who's ever worked with a council or a government will know that quite often the left hand of the government doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and I suppose this is just an example of that. This would see a hasty redesign of the Bristol VR chassis with the engine redesigned to run transverse across the rear in the same way as the Leyland Atlantean and the Daimler Fleet line. But to be honest, this wasn't a happy conversion, and the very early first VRs that were built to this configuration, which became the Bristol VRT, vertical rear transverse, suffered from all sorts of mechanical mishaps. Indeed, so bad were these mechanical mishaps that the Scottish bus operators washed their hands at the first opportunity of the Bristol VRs and swapped them for equal amounts of more reliable Bristol low-deckers from their English companions. And one day I will get around to doing a video on the Bristol low-decker Bristol VR Scottish Bus Group National Bus Company swap over. Many of these early VRs would have to return back to Bristol Commercial Vehicle for various modifications, and it was quite a surprise in 1969 when there were repeat orders announced by some operators for these early, or shall we say Series 1 Bristol VRs. The repeat orders would come from companies such as Brighton Hove and District, Thames Valley, United Automobile and United Counties, whilst at the same time there were new customers who were ordering the Bristol VRTs as well, and this would include companies such as Eastern Counties, Lincolnshire, Midland General, Southern Vectus and Mansfield and District. Now, admittedly, those are the sort of companies that if I said to you about Bristol VR operators, you would probably think of at least 2 or 3 of those. But aside from those orders that you'd kind of expect, there were also orders from 2 municipalities. One of these would be Stockport Corporation, whilst the other would be for Liverpool Corporation. Sadly, the Stockport ones would end up as one of the great what might have beens in the bus industry because not one of them was delivered to Stockport. Both the Stockport and the Merseyside Bristol VRs were due to be bodied by East Lancs of Blackburn. But at the time with the Stockport ones arrived at the factory, there was a huge fire at East Lancs and it wiped out all but one of the Stockport buses. And as a little bit of a deviation away from our main feature on the Merseyside Bristol VRs, this fire at East Lancs would see the only newly completed single-decker Bristol VR emerge. Chassis number VRT SL332 was salvaged and was brought back by Bristol Commercial Vehicles. This would later be sold to an Australian operator, Hills Bus Service of Wollongong, who would fit it with a 47-seat Smithfield single-decker body. And, I believe, lengthen it as well, so it looked a little bit longer than a standard Bristol VR SL, didn't it, when it was done. This same fire at East Lancs would see one of the Merseyside buses destroyed, and this would carry the chassis number of VRT LH2 102. Now, the standard Bristol VR that we've all probably travelled on in National Bus Company or even Tilling fleets is the Bristol VR SL series, short wheelbase, low frame. But there were various other combinations of frame height and wheelbase that would result in other specifications. And these ones for Merseyside were VRTs, LHs, long wheelbase, high frame. The standard short wheelbase Bristol VR would give a body length of about 30 foot 5 inches, whilst the longer wheelbase Bristol VR could be bodied with bodywork up to 32 foot 9 inches. And the high and low chassis frames is something that sounds a little bit more impressive than it actually is. When you say something with a high chassis frame, you think of something like a Leyland Leopard or an AEC Reliance. But the reality was the VR chassis wasn't quite as high as that on a high frame bus. In fact, it was only a few inches higher than the standard height chassis. But I suspect that high chassis frame could make a little bit of a difference when it came to ground clearance in certain parts of the world, Liverpool obviously being one of those places. Now, when Liverpool Corporation ordered these Bristol VRs in 1968, it was literally the last knock-ins for the corporation because, as I said previously, they were taken over by the PTE at the beginning of the following year. So these buses would be delivered to Merseyside PTE and would start arriving in 1970. The long wheelbase and high-framed Bristol VR would have their own chassis number series, the first one being VRT LH2 101, and this would emerge as UKD 520J in November 1970 and would be given the fleet number of 2026. These bodies by East Lancs would seat 49 upstairs and 31 people downstairs and would be fitted with dual doors. As I mentioned previously, Liverpool Corporation had ordered 25 of them originally, and these buses would be delivered in the Liverpool Corporation green livery but would be carrying the new PTEs logo. Now, the first one, which as I said was chassis number 101, arrived in November 1970. And this was numerically the first of the batch. However, with the fire at East Lancs playing havoc with the delivery of buses, this batch started arriving way back in August 1970. Rather unusually as well, the buses carried the same registration prefix, UKD, but sometimes had a different suffix on the number plate, J being for 1970-71, H being for 1969-1970. So the first two, 2026 and 2027, were UKD 520J and UKD 521J, but the third one, 2028, was UKD 522H. Now at the time, remember the registration switchover was just once a year, and that was around August time. And these buses straddled that gap rather nicely. Merseyside PTE would go on to order another 35 of these Bristol VRT LHs, again these bodies being fitted with East Lancs bodywork, and again featuring 80-seat dual-door bodywork. The first of these would arrive in September 1971 and would be given the number 2051 and the registration YKF 689K. Now at this point, Bristol had redesigned the Bristol VR slightly, and this would become the Series 2 Bristol VR. Now, unlike the conventional Bristol VRT SL series, this was started from a new chassis number when the Series 2 was introduced. Incidentally, this was also the first bus ordered by the National Bus Company and was given the chassis number VRT SL2 101, and this would become OFC 901H, which was new to City of Oxford but had been ordered by Southern Vectors. But this didn't happen with the long wheelbase high frame model, and the chassis numbers ran concurrently from the Series 1s into the Series 2s. The last of the Series 1 VRT LHs being UKD 543J, which had the chassis number of VRT LH2 125 and was delivered in October 1970, whilst the next in the sequence, which was 2051, was given the chassis number of VRT LH2 126. this being the first Series 2 specification bus that I mentioned previously. In fact, there were only 60 of these long wheelbase high frame Bristol VRTs built, and they all would go to Merseyside PTE, if of course you include the one that was destroyed by fire. Aside from that, there was 59 serviceable buses for Merseyside PTE. And at this point you might be shouting at me saying, but Jake, Reading Corporation also had long wheelbase Bristol VRs of that era. And you'd be right, but these were VRT LL series long wheelbase low frame buses. So apart from a couple of inches, not exactly the same. And incidentally, if you'd like a video on these long wheelbase Reading Bristol VRs, or Jumbos as they were known at the time, please comment down below. A bit like the MCW bodied ones for West Midlands PTE that would follow a year or so later, all of these Bristol VRs would feature a rear end bustle, a bit like an Atlantean and a Fleetline. Now in the West Midlands PTE video we discussed why this would be, and I suppose there's several options. It's standardisation of bodywork, plus maybe they were worried if there was an engine fire, and let's be fair, a lot of these rear engine buses at the time were suffering from engine fires. This would be a little bit harder to enter the bodywork if the engine was the other side of the firewall. Remember that parcel shelf at the back of a Bristol VR under the window across the top of the engine is mostly made of wood and potentially sometimes rather thin metal, and isn't known for its fire resistant qualities. It's also potentially easier to work on the engine when it's sticking out the back of the bus rather than encapsulated in the bodywork as well. October 1974 would see the arrival of more Bristol VRs with Merseyside PTE. This time though they would be of the more conventional type, the Bristol VRT SL series, the short wheelbase low frame. Basically the same chassis type as the ones that you see in the Tilling and National Bus Company fleets. These will start with fleet number 2096 and would be given the registration of RKB 96N. Merseyside would go on to own 50 of these shorter Bristol VRs, and they did resemble the ones that were being built at the same time for Sheffield Corporation Transport. But despite their similarities, would you believe it, there was surprisingly few bodywork parts that were in common with each of the batches. Numerically, the last bus would be numbered 2145 and will be given the registration GKA 97N, this arriving in September 1975. But no doubt with East Lancs still feeling the after effects of that devastating fire, the last ones were actually delivered in November 1975. The long wheelbase Bristol VRTs would start being taken out of service by Merseyside PTE in 1983, with one of the last ones not being taken out of service until March 1986, this being 2080 YKF 718K. Sadly, records don't show if any of these went to other operators, but it's definitely noted that none of them now survive, which is a shame because this was a very rare and unique batch of buses for Merseyside PTE themselves. 1985-1986 would see the withdrawal starting on the shorter wheelbase Bristol VRs. Fortunately, some of these, if not all of them, found new homes and new operators. Companies such as Morn of Mansfield, Fairway of Kirby, as well as various non-PSV operators would benefit from these buses being sold. In fact, the only surviving bus, which is GKA 74N, ironically wasn't one of these buses that was sold for further service with Kirby's or Morns. December 1986, this bus would be sold to Wirral Building Services for use as a non-PSV. They would hold on to it until 1990, where it would be sold to Wirral Leisure Services and turned into a playbus. It would continue with this up until June 2001, latterly with Lairdyside Community Transport of Birkenhead also using it as a playbus. Fortunately, then it passed into the hands of the Merseyside Transport Trust, who over the last 25 years have been slowly restoring it back to its former glory. And being an East Lancs bus that has been used for other things, it will probably be short of an awful lot of interior components and it will need an awful lot of work done to it. And you have to applaud groups like the Merseyside Transport Trust for taking these vehicles on and even attempting to restore them, especially when you realise that it's all done by volunteers as well. Absolutely amazing. Those buses that passed to Fairway of Kirby had rather mixed lives. Some were withdrawn as early as 1988, while others lasted into the very early 90s, 1994 being the latest that one seemed to be around till. The ones with Mawns seemed to last until 1990, although GKA 64N was sold in January 1993 to Forest of Bootle, where it would soldier on until 1993 before being sold for scrap. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at this rather strange and unique batch of Bristol VRs that were in the Merseyside fleet. Apologies it's gone on a little bit longer than I intended, but the story's been a little bit twisty and a little bit turny, and I did want to put as much detail about the vehicles in as I possibly could. I couldn't find any operational history about them, so if you'd like to put that in the comments down below, I'd be ever so grateful. Do you remember travelling on them? Do you remember working on them, driving them? And what are your thoughts on these Bristol VRs? I'd love to read them all down below in the comments. If you did enjoy this video, please like, hype and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my future releases. Recent figures say that 64% of people watching this video aren't subscribed. And it's free. You don't have to pay for it. You just receive notifications when I make releases with other videos. If you're enjoying the channel content and you like what we do, you can always buy me a drink via the super thanks button down below. And I will thank you in advance. Very kind of you too. Thank you ever so much for watching and continuing to support the channel. It really does mean an awful lot to me and the buses that the money raised by YouTube goes to help. Bye for now.